The scream tore through the great hall before anyone understood what was happening. Illyra Voss stood frozen at the top of the stone steps, her hand still gripping the cold iron railing, watching her own husband press his lips to her sister's mouth in the shadow of the west corridor. The candles flickered against the stone walls. The music from the celebration downstairs still drifted up, faint and cheerful, completely unaware that everything was about to break. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Then Chaol Draven pulled back from Sable Voss and turned his head, and his eyes met Illyra's, and there was no shame in them. No fear, only a kind of tired resignation, as if he had been caught doing something inevitable rather than something wrong. "Illyra," he said, and his voice was calm in a way that made her stomach twist. "This isn't what you think." But it was exactly what she thought. It was exactly what her body already knew, because the bond between them, the one that had connected her heart to his for 2 years, had been sending her warnings for weeks. A dull ache behind her ribs, a coldness that crept in at night. She had told herself it was stress. She had told herself 100 lies to avoid this exact moment. Sable did not look away. She did not apologize. She simply straightened her dress with steady hands and said, "You were never going to be enough for him, Illyra. You know that. You've always known that." The words landed like a blow. Illyra's whole life, people had compared them. Twins born 4 minutes apart, identical in face but never in nature. Sable had always been the sharper one, the hungrier one, the one who wanted more than what she was given. Illyra had been content with small things. A quiet life. A mate who loved her. She had never imagined she would need to fight her own sister for either. "How long?" Illyra asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "How long has this been going on?" Chaol did not answer right away. That silence told her everything. "Long enough," Sable said, when he didn't speak. "Long enough that you should stop asking questions you don't want the answers to." Illyra felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she knew it hadn't moved at all. She thought of every night Chaol had come home late, blaming border patrols and council meetings. She thought of every time Sable had shown up at their chambers with wine and sympathy, sitting close, touching her sister's shoulder, saying she only wanted to help since Chaol seemed so overwhelmed lately. She thought of how she had thanked her sister for being so caring. She had thanked her. The rage came slower than the grief, but it came. It rose up through her chest like heat through ice, and for a moment, she thought she might do something she couldn't take back. Her claws wanted to lengthen. Her wolf, usually calm and steady beneath her skin, was clawing at the inside of her ribs, desperate to be let loose. But Illyra had never been a woman who let her anger choose her actions. She breathed through it, the way her mother had taught her, long before her mother had died, and she looked at the 2 people who had betrayed her most in the world. "Get out of my sight," she said. "Both of you." Chaol took a step toward her instead, one hand raised as though he could smooth this over the way he smoothed over disputes among his commanders. "Illyra, let me explain. The bond, it's not what we thought it was. I've felt it fading for months. I didn't choose this. It happened." "Nothing happened," Illyra said. "You made choices. Every single day you made a choice, and you chose her." Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked almost like anger, as though her refusal to comfort him was itself an offense. "You don't understand what it's like to carry this kingdom. You never wanted the crown, Illyra. You've said so yourself. Sable understands ambition. She understands what I need." "What you need," Illyra repeated quietly, "was someone honest. I could have given you that too, if you had asked." She did not wait for his answer. She turned and walked down the corridor, past the guards who had frozen at their posts, unsure whether to intervene in a quarrel between their king and queen. She walked past the great hall where the celebration continued, oblivious. She walked out into the cold night air, and only then did she let herself shake. The Draven territory stretched across the northern mountains, a kingdom of pine forests and stone fortresses, ruled for generations by alphas strong enough to hold it together through sheer will. Chaol had inherited the throne young, after his father's sudden passing, and the pack had worried, in those early years, whether he was ready. Illyra remembered the night the bond had chosen them, 2 years ago now, at her 18th moon ceremony. She remembered the way the whole hall had gone silent, the way the invisible thread between their hearts had snapped into place, with a certainty that could not be argued with. Fated bonds were rare. Some alphas went their whole lives without finding one. And here it was, in front of everyone, undeniable. She had believed, in that moment, that she was the luckiest woman alive. She had not known then that a bond could be manipulated, that it could be strained, neglected, and eventually broken by the very person who was supposed to protect it. Illyra walked without direction, her bare feet cold against the stone paths of the courtyard, until she found herself at the edge of the training yard, where she used to watch Cale spar with his men in the early days of their marriage. Back then he used to catch her eye between matches and grin like a boy who had gotten away with something wonderful. Back then she had thought that grin belonged only to her. She sat on the low wall bordering the yard and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. You shouldn't be out here alone. She looked up. Rowan Ashby, one of the pack's senior guards and one of the few people in the fortress she trusted completely, stood a respectful distance away, his hands tucked into his coat pockets against the chill. He had served under Cale's father before Cale had watched Illyra grow from a nervous young bride into a queen the pack had come to respect in her own quiet way. I'm fine, she said, though her voice cracked slightly on the second word. Rowan didn't push. He simply came and sat a few feet away from her on the wall, giving her space, but not leaving her alone with whatever was happening behind her eyes. Word travels fast in a fortress like this, he said eventually. I heard what happened in the West Corridor. Illyra let out a short, humorless breath. Of course you did. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your fault my husband can't keep his hands off my sister. The bitterness in her own voice startled her. She had never spoken like that before, never let herself sound so sharp, so exposed. But something had cracked open tonight, and she suspected the version of herself that existed before this moment was gone for good. Rowan was quiet for a long moment. What will you do? It was a fair question, and Illyra didn't have an answer. In the pack's tradition, bonds were sacred. They were not meant to be broken, not by choice and rarely by force. She had heard of the ritual, of course, the old texts describing how a fated bond could be severed under specific and painful circumstances, but she had always thought of it as something distant, something from stories told to frighten young wolves into taking their bonds seriously. She had never imagined it might be used against her. I don't know, she admitted. I need to think. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the small library at the edge of the East Wing, surrounded by books she had read a dozen times before, waiting for the sun to rise and bring some kind of clarity with it. It did not come. Instead, as the first gray light crept through the windows, a servant arrived with a summons. The king wished to see her in the council chamber. Illyra's stomach dropped. A summons through the council chamber was not personal. It was official. Whatever Cale intended to say to her, he intended to say it in front of witnesses. She dressed carefully, choosing a deep green gown that had once been her favorite, one Cale had complimented the first time she wore it. She told herself it didn't matter what she wore. She told herself she was only choosing it because it made her feel steady, not because some small, foolish part of her still wanted him to look at her and remember what he was losing. The council chamber was full when she arrived. Advisors, elders, senior pack members, all seated around the long table, their faces carefully neutral in the way people's faces become when they already know something terrible is about to happen and are trying not to show it. Sable stood near the head of the table, not seated, as though she hadn't yet decided what her place in this room was. Cale sat at the head, and when Illyra entered, he stood. Illyra, he said, thank you for coming. Did I have a choice? She asked, and a few of the elders exchanged uneasy glances. Cale's jaw tightened. I want to be honest with you, in front of the council, about what has happened and what I believe needs to happen next. Illyra crossed her arms. Go on. The bond between us, he began, and she could hear how carefully he had rehearsed this, has not been what either of us hoped it would be. I believe fate made an error in choosing us. I have felt it weakening for some time, and I no longer believe it serves either of us to remain bound to something that isn't working. A murmur moved through the room. One of the older council members, a woman named Petra Lindquist, who had served 3 generations of Draven Alphas, leaned forward with a frown. Cale, breaking a fated bond is not something done lightly. The ritual carries consequences, especially for the one who is severed. You understand this. I understand it, Kael said, though he did not look at Alira when he said it. But I believe it's the right path forward, for the kingdom, and for all of us. Alira felt something cold settle over her, colder than the anger from the night before. This was not a man asking for forgiveness. This was not even a man trying to explain himself honestly. This was a king, already certain of his decision, using the council chamber to make his betrayal look like policy instead of cruelty. You've already decided, she said quietly. Alira. You've already decided, she repeated, louder this time. And you brought me here so the council would witness you saying it, so it would look proper instead of what it actually is. Sable stepped forward then, and something about the confidence in her posture, the ease with which she inserted herself into a conversation that was tearing her sister apart, made Alira's hands curl into fists at her sides. This isn't about hurting you, Sable said. This is about doing what's right for the pack. Kael needs a mate who can stand beside him, who can carry the weight of leadership. You've never wanted that, Alira. You've said so yourself, more than once. I wanted him, Alira said, her voice finally breaking. I never asked to be a queen. I only ever wanted my husband to be honest with me. That was all I asked. The room had gone completely silent. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to have gone quiet, as though the whole fortress was holding its breath. Petra Lindquist spoke again, her voice careful. Kael, I must ask you to reconsider. The severing ritual is not something to invoke over a matter of the heart. It causes real harm, lasting harm. I know what it costs, Kael said, and for the first time since Alira had entered the room, something like guilt flickered across his face. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. I've made my decision. The ritual will take place at the next full moon, 3 days from now. 3 days. Alira stood in the center of the council chamber, surrounded by people who had once respected her, watching the man she loved calmly schedule the destruction of everything that connected them, as if he were scheduling a hunting trip or a border patrol. She waited for someone to object more forcefully. She waited for the elders to overrule him, to remind him that a king did not get to unmake a sacred bond simply because he had grown tired of his wife. No one objected. No one dared. Kael was still the Alpha King. His word, however cruel, was still law. She left the chamber without another word, walking fast enough that her skirts snapped against her ankles, and she did not stop until she reached her chambers and shut the door behind her. Only then did she allow herself to sink to the floor, back pressed against the heavy wood, and let the tears come. 3 days. In 3 days, whatever had connected her to Kael Draven since the night of her 18th moon ceremony would be torn apart, deliberately, publicly, by his own choice. She had heard enough about the severing ritual over the years to know what it would do to her. The bond was not just a feeling, it was woven into a wolf's very being, into the rhythm of the heart, into the pull that guided a mate home no matter how far she wandered. Breaking it by choice, especially the choice of only one party, was said to leave the rejected mate in a kind of agony that could take years to recover from, if recovery came at all. Some wolves who survived the severing never regained their full strength. Some never trusted another bond again. And Kael knew all of this. He had grown up hearing the same stories she had. He knew exactly what he was choosing to do to her, and he had chosen it anyway, because it was easier than admitting he had fallen for her sister and simply asking for a divorce like an honorable man would have. A knock came at her door sometime later. She didn't answer it. It came again, softer this time, and then Rowan's voice, low and careful, on the other side. Alira, it's me. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and pushed herself up from the floor, unlocking the door to let him in. He took one look at her, and his expression darkened, though he said nothing about it directly. I heard, he said. The whole fortress has heard by now. 3 days, Alira said, her voice hollow. He gave me 3 days. Rowan was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man choosing his words with great caution. There may be another path. Alira looked up at him. What do you mean? The severing ritual requires both parties to be present within the fortress grounds when the moon reaches its peak. If the rejected mate isn't present, the ritual cannot be completed in the traditional way. It would have to be delayed, or performed in a diminished form that carries far less consequence. Hope, small and fragile, flickered in Alira's chest for the first time since the night before. "You're saying I could leave?" "I'm saying it's possible," Rowan said. "It would mean leaving everything behind. Your title, your home, everyone you've ever known. It would mean starting over somewhere far from here, likely somewhere beyond Draven territory altogether, because if Kael wanted to find you, wanted to force the issue eventually, he has the resources and the authority to try." Alira thought of the fortress that had been her home for 2 years. She thought of the gardens she had planted, the friends she had made among the pack, the life she had imagined building here even as it quietly crumbled around her without her knowledge. She thought of her sister's face, calm and unbothered, standing beside the man who was supposed to be Alira's forever. "There's nothing left for me here," she said quietly. "Not anymore." "Then we should move quickly," Rowan said. "If you intend to leave before the ritual, it needs to happen tonight, while the fortress is still recovering from the announcement, and attention is elsewhere. Waiting even one more day gives Kael time to post additional guards at the borders." Alira nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside her, some old, frightened version of herself falling away, and something steadier taking its place. She was not going to stay and let them break her in front of the entire pack. She was not going to give Kael the satisfaction of watching her collapse the way the old texts described. If he wanted to be rid of her, he would have to live with the fact that she had chosen to walk away first. "I'll need supplies," she said, "and I'll need to leave without anyone seeing." "I can help with both," Rowan said. "But Alira, I need you to understand what you're choosing. Once you're beyond the border, you won't have the protection of the Draven pack anymore. You'll be a lone wolf in territory that doesn't know you, doesn't owe you anything. It will be hard, possibly harder than staying." Alira looked at him steadily, and for the first time since she'd seen Kael's mouth on her sister's, something like resolve settled into her spine. "Staying means letting them break me in front of everyone I know. I would rather face difficulty as a free woman than agony as a rejected queen." Rowan studied her for a long moment, and then he nodded, something like respect passing across his features. "Then we leave tonight." The fortress at night was a different creature than the fortress by day. Torches burned low along the outer walls, and the guards who remained on duty moved through their rounds with the tired rhythm of men counting down the hours until their shift ended. Alira moved through the servant corridors Rowan showed her, corridors she had never known existed, despite living in the fortress for 2 years. Corridors built centuries ago for exactly this kind of quiet escape. She carried only a small pack. A few changes of clothes, a blade Rowan had insisted she take, along with instruction on how to use it if the need arose. A small amount of coin, all he could gather on short notice without drawing suspicion. It was not much to build a new life on. It would have to be enough. At the edge of the servants' gate, hidden behind a row of storage sheds, Rowan stopped and turned to face her. "This is as far as I can go without someone noticing my absence," he said. "Beyond this gate, you're on your own until you're well past the border markers." Alira nodded, throat tight. "Thank you, for everything." "Don't thank me yet," Rowan said. "Thank me if you make it out safely. And Alira, one more thing." "Yes?" "Don't look back. Whatever you hear, whatever you feel, don't turn around, and don't come back through this gate. If Kael discovers you're missing before dawn, he may send trackers, and you'll need every hour of head start you can get." She nodded once, firmly, and slipped through the gate into the darkness beyond. The forest outside the fortress was thick and cold, the kind of cold that settled into a person's bones and refused to leave. Alira moved quickly, guided by the pale light of the half-moon overhead, her senses sharpened by fear and adrenaline in equal measure. She did not shift, not yet, worried that the sound and scent of a wolf running through the territory at night might draw more attention than a lone woman moving carefully through the trees. She kept to the game trails Rowan had described to her, trails that wound away from the main roads and toward the southern border, the fastest route out of Draven territory and into the free lands beyond. She had gone perhaps 2 hours when she felt it. A pull, deep in her chest, sudden and sharp, like a hook catching in her ribs. She stumbled, one hand flying to her chest, and for a moment, she thought the ritual had somehow already begun, that Cale had moved up the timeline and was severing the bond early, out of spite or impatience. But the pull was different from what she expected. It was not agony, it was awareness. Somewhere behind her, miles back toward the fortress, Cale had woken, and through whatever remained of their fraying bond, he knew, with sudden and absolute certainty, that his wife was gone. Illyra did not stop moving. If anything, the realization pushed her faster, deeper into the trees, her breath coming in sharp clouds in the cold night air. She thought of Rowan's warning, "Don't look back." She didn't. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the darkness ahead of her, on the border she needed to cross before the sun rose, and turned her escape into a hunt. Behind her, far in the distance, she thought she heard the first low, mournful howl rise up from the fortress walls. Whether it was Cale's voice or simply her imagination, she would never be certain. She did not turn to find out. She kept running, into the dark, toward whatever life waited for her on the other side of the border, leaving behind the crown, the title, the husband who had broken her heart, and the sister who had helped him do it. She left behind the girl who had once believed a fated bond meant she would never have to be alone. That girl, she understood now, was gone. What remained was someone new, someone still forming in the darkness of the forest, someone who would have to learn, in the difficult months and years ahead, exactly who she was without a crown to define her, and a bond to hold her in place. The border marker came into view just as the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon. Illyra crossed it without slowing down, without ceremony, without a single glance backward, at the kingdom she was leaving behind forever. She was free, and she was utterly, completely alone. It was, she thought, the first honest feeling she'd had in weeks. The first 3 days beyond the border were the hardest of Illyra's life. She had crossed into the free lands with nothing but a small pack of supplies and a blade she barely knew how to use, and within hours she understood how little she truly knew about surviving outside the walls of a fortress. The free lands were not empty, as she had imagined from the safety of her old library. They were wild, unclaimed, populated by rogue wolves who answered to no alpha and followed no law beyond their own hunger and their own will. Some of them were simply wolves who had never found a pack. Others had been cast out of their packs for reasons Illyra did not want to guess at. All of them looked at a lone woman traveling without protection as either an easy target or a valuable prize. She learned quickly to move at night and rest in daylight, when the free lands were quieter and the predators, both wolf and human, were less likely to be prowling. She learned to read the forest for signs of danger, the way the birds went silent before a larger animal approached, the way certain trails smelled of territory markers that warned other wolves to stay away. She learned these things the way anyone learns anything under pressure, quickly and imperfectly, making mistakes that could have cost her everything if luck had not occasionally favored her. On the second night, she nearly walked into the camp of 3 rogue wolves gathered around a low fire, and only the sound of their laughter, carried on the wind before she came within sight of the flames, saved her from stumbling directly into their midst. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering, and did not sleep again until she had put several more miles between herself and their camp. On the third day, hunger began to gnaw at her in a way she had never experienced. She had grown up with food always available, had never once in her life gone more than a few hours without a meal if she wanted one. Now she found herself digging through the underbrush for anything edible, her stomach cramping with a hollow ache that made it difficult to think clearly. She caught a rabbit late on the third night, more by desperate instinct than skill, and ate it raw beside a stream, because she was too exhausted and too frightened to risk a fire that might draw attention. She thought, more than once during those first days, of turning back. Not because she wanted to return to Cale, not because she missed the fortress or the crown or any of the trappings of the life she had left behind, but because the sheer difficulty of survival outside the pack structure she had known her whole life made her question whether freedom was worth this kind of suffering. She thought of warm beds and full tables, and guards who kept danger at a comfortable distance. She thought of how easy it would be to simply walk back through the border marker and let the severing ritual happen, let it be over with, rather than face this slow, grinding uncertainty. But then she would think of Sable's face, calm and untroubled, telling her she had never been enough. She would think of Cale's voice in the council chamber, scheduling the destruction of their bond as though it were a matter of policy. And the hunger, the cold, the exhaustion, all of it became easier to bear than the thought of standing in that fortress and letting them break her in front of everyone she had ever known. She kept walking. On the 5th day, she found the river. It was wide and slow-moving, cutting through a valley thick with birch trees, and something about the sight of it, glittering under the pale morning sun, made Elira stop and simply stand still for the first time in days. She had been moving constantly since she crossed the border, driven by fear and adrenaline, never allowing herself to rest for more than a few hours at a time. But here, beside this river, in a valley that felt somehow separate from the danger she had been fleeing, something in her finally allowed itself to slow down. She followed the river for the rest of that day, and as evening approached, she came upon a small settlement she had not expected to find in territory she had believed was entirely unclaimed. It was not large, perhaps 30 or 40 structures built from timber and stone, arranged along the riverbank in a way that suggested careful planning, rather than the chaotic sprawl of a rogue camp. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Children's voices carried faintly on the wind. It looked, more than anything, like a village. Elira approached cautiously, keeping to the tree line, watching for any sign of danger before she revealed herself. She had learned enough in the past 5 days not to trust appearances easily. But as she watched, she saw an elderly woman step out of one of the timber structures to hang laundry on a line, and something about the ordinary, peaceful nature of the scene convinced her to take the risk. She stepped out from the trees. The woman spotted her immediately and straightened, her expression shifting from surprise to caution in the span of a heartbeat. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice carrying the accent of the Western Territories, a region Elira knew only from maps and old stories. "No," Elira admitted. "I'm not from anywhere anymore." The woman studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn clothing, the exhaustion etched into her face, the way she stood with the careful stillness of someone who had spent days expecting danger from every direction. Whatever she saw seemed to soften something in her expression. "You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in some time," the woman said. "Come inside before you fall over." Elira hesitated only a moment before following her. The woman's name was Odessa Marsh, and the village, Elira learned over a bowl of warm stew that tasted better than any meal she had eaten in the fortress, was called Thornhollow. It had been founded decades earlier by wolves who had left their packs for various reasons, some by choice and some by force, and had decided that rather than wander the free lands alone, they would build something together, a place without an alpha, governed instead by a council of elders who made decisions collectively. "We don't ask too many questions here," Odessa told her, settling into a chair across the small wooden table. "Most everyone in Thornhollow left something behind. Doesn't much matter what, as long as you're willing to work, and willing to respect the peace we've built." "I can work," Elira said quickly. "I'll do anything." Odessa raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the intensity of her response, but she didn't press for details. "We'll see what you're good at come morning. For now, eat, and then sleep. You look like you haven't done either properly in days." Elira did as she was told, and that night, for the first time since she had crossed the border, she slept without waking every hour, at every sound in the darkness. She slept in a small room at the back of Odessa's home, on a narrow cot that felt more comfortable than any bed she had ever known, and when she woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through a small window, she felt something she had not expected to feel, so soon after everything that had happened. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something close to safe. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were survivable in a way the first days of her exile had not been. Elira threw herself into whatever work Thornhollow needed. She helped tend the small gardens that provided much of the village's food. She helped repair fences and roofs damaged by storms. She learned, slowly, the rhythms of a community built not on hierarchy and fated bonds but on mutual need and mutual respect. She did not tell anyone who she truly was. As far as the people of Thornhollow knew, she was simply Elira, a lone wolf who had left her pack behind for reasons she preferred not to discuss. No one pressed her for more. Odessa's warning had been accurate. In Thorn Hollow, everyone carried some kind of wound from their past, and the unspoken rule was that those wounds belonged to the person who carried them, and no one else. Slowly, she began to notice something changing within herself. In the fortress, she had always been defined by her relationship to others. She was Kale's mate. She was Sable's twin sister. She was the quiet queen who preferred gardens to politics, who let others make the decisions that shaped her life. Here, in Thorn Hollow, she was simply herself, defined by nothing except what she chose to do each day. She found, to her surprise, that she was good at organizing things. When a dispute arose between two families over water rights along the river, it was Alira who suggested a rotation system that satisfied both sides. When the village's food stores ran dangerously low one particularly harsh month, it was Alira who proposed a rationing plan that got them through until the next harvest, without anyone going hungry. She had spent 2 years in the fortress, believing she had no talent for leadership, no interest in the responsibilities that came with power. She began to wonder if that belief had simply been a story she told herself, one that had made it easier to stay small, to stay quiet, to stay in the shadow of a husband who preferred her that way. 3 months after her arrival, Odessa approached her with a proposition. "The council has an opening," she said. "One of our elders passed last month. May he rest easy, and we need someone to take his place. Several of the others have suggested your name." Alira blinked in surprise. "Me? I've only been here 3 months." 3 months, and in that time you've solved more problems for this village than some folks manage in 3 years, Odessa said. "The council isn't about how long you've lived here. It's about whether you can be trusted to make decisions that serve everyone, not just yourself. I think you can. I think most of us think you can." Alira sat with the offer for several days before accepting it. There was a part of her, still healing from the wound Kale and Sable had left, that flinched at the idea of taking on responsibility again, of putting herself in a position where others depended on her judgment. She had trusted her judgment once before, had trusted a bond and a marriage and a crown, and it had all been built on lies she never suspected. But Thorn Hollow was different. There was no crown here, no throne, no fated bond binding her to anyone against her will. If she took a seat on the council, it would be because the people of this village had chosen her, freely, based on what she had actually done, rather than what fate had decided for her. She accepted the position. Word of her rise within Thorn Hollow's small society spread slowly through the free lands, as word tends to do among wolves who move frequently between settlements and camps. It reached other villages, other loose collections of rogue wolves scattered throughout the territory beyond Draven lands. It did not, for a long while, reach anyone within the fortress itself, separated as Thorn Hollow was, by miles of forest, and by the simple fact that few in Draven territory had reason to travel so far beyond their own borders. Alira did not think much, in those early months, about whether Kale knew she had survived, whether he wondered what had become of her, whether the severing ritual he had scheduled for that fateful full moon had ever taken place in some diminished form despite her absence, as Rowan had warned it might. She tried, with varying degrees of success, not to think of the fortress at all. But some nights, when the moon was full and bright over Thorn Hollow's rooftops, she would find herself standing outside, looking north toward the mountains where the Draven fortress stood, and she would feel something faint and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not the sharp, insistent pull of a fully intact bond, the kind she had felt in the earliest days of her marriage, something quieter than that, something that felt more like a scar than an open wound, a reminder of what had once connected her to a man who had chosen someone else. She wondered, on those nights, whether he ever thought of her at all. A year passed in Thorn Hollow before Alira learned anything definite about what had happened in the fortress after her departure. The news came from a traveling merchant named Callum Ashworth, who passed through the village every few months, trading goods between the free lands and the border territories, and who had, on this particular visit, brought with him gossip from deeper within Draven lands than usual. "You hear about the Draven court?" he asked one evening, as Alira helped him unload crates of dried goods at the village's small trading post. "Big scandal a while back. King's original mate disappeared right before some kind of ceremony, and he ended up marrying her twin sister instead. Whole territory's still talking about it, from what I hear. Alira's hands went still over the crate she was unpacking. Is that so? She said carefully, keeping her voice as neutral as she could manage. Strange business, Callum continued, oblivious to the way her heart had begun to pound. Some say the first mate ran off because she couldn't handle the responsibilities of being queen. Others say there was something else going on, something the king's not talking about. Either way, the new queen, the sister, she's not exactly beloved, from what I've heard. Rules with a heavy hand. Pack's not as content as they used to be. Interesting, Alira managed. Callum shrugged, moving on to the next crate, already losing interest in gossip that meant nothing to him personally. Politics of the Packs never much interest me. I just move goods where they need to go. Alira finished helping him unload in something of a daze, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just heard. Chaol and Sable were married now then. The severing ritual, or some version of it, must have taken place despite her absence, or perhaps a new bond had formed between them, in whatever way alphas and their chosen mates formed bonds outside of fate's original selection. She felt, strangely, less pain at this news than she expected. It had been over a year since that night in the West Corridor. The wound had not fully healed, but it had scarred over enough that this confirmation felt less like fresh agony and more like the closing of a door she had already, in her heart, walked away from months earlier. What interested her more was the second part of Callum's gossip. Sable ruled with a heavy hand. The pack was not as content as it used to be. Alira found herself thinking, in the days that followed, about the queen her sister must have become. Sable had always wanted power, had always chafed at being the twin who stood one step behind, born 4 minutes later and treated, in Sable's own mind at least, as 4 minutes less important for it. Alira could imagine, without much difficulty, how that hunger might curdle into something harsh once Sable finally held the position she had wanted her whole life. She wondered, distantly, whether Chaol had realized yet what he had traded away. Life in Thornhollow continued, steady and demanding in the way that building any life from nothing tends to be. Alira threw herself into her responsibilities on the council, learning the intricacies of governing a community without the structures of a traditional pack, learning to balance competing interests and personalities without the authority of a crown to back up her decisions. She had to earn respect here in a way she never had to in the fortress, where her position as Chaol's mate had granted her a kind of automatic deference, regardless of whether she had done anything to earn it. She found, over time, that she preferred it this way. She made friends in the village, people who knew her only as the woman she had become, rather than the queen she had once been. She grew close to Odessa, who became something like the mother figure Alira had lost years before her own mother's passing. She grew close, too, to a handful of other wolves her own age, rogues who had found their way to Thornhollow from various corners of the Freelands, each carrying their own story of loss and reinvention. Among them was a wolf named Dorian Ash, quiet and steady, who had lost his own pack to a territorial dispute years before Alira's arrival, and had helped build much of Thornhollow's early infrastructure with his own hands. He and Alira worked together often on council matters, and over the months, a friendship developed between them, careful and unhurried, built on mutual respect rather than the overwhelming pull of a fated bond. She did not fall in love with him, not in those early years, not in the way stories often suggested was inevitable when two wolves spent enough time together. But she valued him, valued the steadiness he brought to her days, valued the fact that whatever connection grew between them, grew because they chose it, moment by moment, rather than because some invisible force had decided it for them before either of them had any say in the matter. She was learning, slowly, that there could be a kind of love, or at least a kind of connection, that did not require the surrender of her whole self, the way her bond with Chaol had. She was learning that she could build something meaningful without waiting for fate to hand it to her. It would be several more years before the world beyond Thornhollow's borders came looking for her again. Years in which she would grow stronger, sharper, more certain of herself than she had ever been within the walls of the Draven fortress. Years in which the frightened, betrayed young woman who had fled across the border in the dead of night would slowly, deliberately, become someone else entirely. Someone who, when the reckoning finally came, would not be so easily broken. 3 years after Elira first stumbled into Thornhollow, half-starved and running from a life that no longer existed, a rider arrived at the village gates, carrying news that would change the direction of everything she had built. His name was Garrick Voss, no relation to Elira despite the shared surname, a common enough name among wolves from the Western Territories. He was the leader of a smaller settlement 2 days' ride from Thornhollow, a collection of rogue wolves who had never managed to organize themselves with the same success Thornhollow had achieved. He arrived at the council chamber, exhausted and travel-worn, requesting an audience with the elders. "We're being pushed out," he said, once he had been given water and a moment to catch his breath. "A group of wolves from the Eastern Territories, stronger than us, better organized. They've been expanding their claim for months now. They've already taken 2 of the smaller camps near our borders. We don't have the numbers to hold them off much longer." Odessa, who had grown older and more tired in the years since Elira's arrival, but remained sharp as ever, frowned deeply. "This isn't the first we've heard of this. There have been rumors of eastern wolves pushing westward for the better part of a year." "It's more than rumors now," Garrick said grimly. "If they take our settlement, Thornhollow will be next in their path. You're larger than us, but not by so much that you'd be safe from a force determined enough." The council fell into debate, voices rising and overlapping as the elders weighed the threat and considered their options. Thornhollow had never needed to think much about defense before. Its remote location and lack of valuable resources had kept it largely ignored by the power struggles that occupied packs closer to the border territories. That safety, it seemed, was no longer guaranteed. Elira listened to the debate for a long while before finally speaking. "We need more than discussion," she said, and the chamber quieted, accustomed by now to her measured, practical way of approaching problems. "If this threat is real, and it sounds as though it is, we need to organize a proper defense, and we need to do it quickly. Talking about the danger doesn't make us safer. Preparing for it does." "And what do you propose?" one of the older council members asked, not unkindly, but with the skepticism of a man who had spent his whole life avoiding conflict rather than preparing for it. "We train," Elira said, "every able wolf in this village, and in Garrick's settlement, and any others willing to join us. We organize watches along our borders. We build alliances with neighboring settlements, rather than waiting to be picked off one at a time. If these eastern wolves want to expand, we make it costly enough that they look elsewhere." The room fell silent for a moment, considering the proposal. It was Odessa who finally spoke. "You sound like someone who has thought about this before." Elira hesitated, aware that what she was about to say would reveal more about her past than she had ever shared with anyone in Thornhollow beyond Odessa herself. "I grew up around a fortress that took its defense seriously. I learned things, even if I never expected to use them. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough." The council, faced with a genuine threat and a genuine plan, voted to move forward with Elira's proposal, and within days, she found herself at the center of an effort unlike anything she had undertaken since arriving in Thornhollow. She organized training sessions, drawing on fragments of knowledge she had absorbed simply from living within the Draven fortress, watching guards train in the yard, listening to strategy discussions she had never been meant to fully understand. She reached out to Garrick's settlement and 2 others in the surrounding area, proposing a loose alliance for mutual defense, an idea that had never existed among the scattered rogue communities of the Freelands before. It took months of careful, exhausting work, but slowly, a network began to form, small settlements that had once operated in complete isolation, now sharing information, coordinating patrols, supporting one another in ways that made each individually stronger than they had been alone. The Eastern threat, when it finally came, arrived in the form of a scouting party rather than a full assault. A group of a dozen wolves testing the strength of Thornhollow's defenses under cover of darkness. They found, to their evident surprise, a village that was not the easy target they had expected. Trained watchers spotted them before they reached the outer fields. Coordinated horns alerted the neighboring settlements, and within an hour, a defensive force larger than the scouting party had anticipated had assembled to meet them. There was no battle that night. The scouts, recognizing that Thornhollow was better prepared than their intelligence had suggested, retreated without engaging. But the message was clear enough. This collection of villages was no longer an easy target, and the eastern wolves would need to reconsider whether pushing further west was worth the cost. The victory, quiet and bloodless as it was, changed something in how the surrounding settlements viewed Alira. She had not led the defense alone, had not claimed any singular credit for the strategy that had kept them safe, but everyone involved knew whose planning and whose persistence had made the difference. Word spread, as it tends to in close-knit communities, and within Thornhollow and the settlements now allied with it, Alira's name began to carry a particular kind of respect. "You should consider taking on a more formal role," Odessa told her one evening, several weeks after the scouting party's retreat. "Not just on our council, but across the alliance we've built. Someone needs to coordinate between the settlements, and everyone trusts you to do it fairly." Alira felt the familiar hesitation rise in her chest, the same reluctance that had made her flinch at the idea of joining the council years earlier. But something had shifted in her since then. She had spent 3 years proving to herself, moment by moment, decision by decision, that she was capable of leading, capable of earning trust through her actions, rather than inheriting it through a bond she had never chosen. The fear that had once made her shrink from responsibility no longer held the same power over her. "I'll do it," she said, "on one condition. This isn't about one person holding authority over everyone else. Every settlement keeps its own council, its own voice. I'll coordinate, but I won't rule." "That," Odessa said with something like pride in her voice, "is exactly why we trust you with it." Over the following 2 years, the alliance Alira had helped build grew steadily stronger. What had once been a handful of isolated, vulnerable settlements scattered through the free lands became something more organized, more resilient, a loose confederation bound not by fate or by force, but by shared interest and hard-earned trust. They called it, informally at first, and then with growing permanence, the Border Alliance, a name that reflected both its location along the edges of the established Pact territories and its purpose of protecting that border from encroachment. Alira did not sit at the head of a throne. There was no crown in the Border Alliance, no fated bond determining who held power and who did not. But she became, over those 2 years, the closest thing the alliance had to a central figure, the person other settlements turned to when disputes arose, when threats emerged, when decisions needed to be made that affected more than a single village. She earned this position the way she had earned every position of respect since crossing that border years earlier, through consistent, careful, honest work, through decisions made with the good of the community in mind rather than her own gain. Dorian, who had grown closer to her over the years without either of them rushing to name what existed between them, stood beside her through much of this growth, a steady presence who never seemed threatened by her rising influence, who seemed, if anything, quietly proud of the woman she had become. Their relationship remained unhurried, built on years of shared work and mutual respect rather than any dramatic declaration. And Alira found a kind of peace in that slowness that she had never experienced with Cale, whose bond had swept her into a marriage before she had truly known who he was as a person. She thought of Cale less often as the years passed. When she did think of him, it was with a kind of distant clarity rather than the raw pain that had defined her first months of exile. She had built something real in the years since he broke their bond, something that belonged entirely to her, unearned by fate and unstolen by betrayal. Whatever kingdom he ruled with Sable at his side, it could not touch what she had built here, in the free lands, among people who valued her for exactly who she was. She did not know, in those years of steady growth, that word of the Border Alliance's strength had begun to travel far beyond the free lands, carried by merchants and travelers into territories she had once called home. She did not know that her name, mentioned in passing by traders like Callum Ashworth, had begun to reach ears within the Draven fortress itself, or that the mention of a rogue leader named Alira, building something unprecedented along the southern border, had begun to trouble a king who had once been certain he would never hear that name again. The trouble in the Draven fortress, unknown to Alira at the time, had been building steadily since the year of her departure. Sable Voss had become queen, in a ceremony far less grand than the one that had marked Alira's original bonding to Cale, a hurried affair meant to legitimize a relationship that had already scandalized much of the pack. The bond between Sable and Chaol, formed through choice rather than fate, lacked the effortless certainty that had once connected Chaol to Illyra. It required constant tending, constant reassurance, constant negotiation between two people whose relationship had been built on ambition and convenience as much as genuine affection. Sable, once queen, discovered quickly that the power she had craved for so long came with burdens she had not fully anticipated. The pack, still grieving the loss of a queen many had genuinely loved, did not extend to Sable the same warmth or trust they had once given Illyra. She found herself governing a court that watched her with suspicion, that whispered about the circumstances of her rise to power in corners she was not meant to hear. She responded to this suspicion, as ambitious people sometimes do when faced with resistance, by tightening her grip, rather than working to earn the trust she lacked. Policies grew stricter, punishments for dissent grew harsher. The warmth that had once characterized the Draven court under Illyra's quiet influence curdled, over the years, into something colder and more fearful. Chaol, for his part, found himself increasingly troubled by the queen he had chosen. The ease he had once felt with Sable, the excitement of a forbidden connection finally allowed to flourish in the open, gave way over the years to a growing awareness of the differences between the woman he had married and the woman he had left behind. Sable was sharp where Illyra had been gentle, demanding where Illyra had been patient, quick to anger where Illyra had almost always found a way to soften conflict rather than escalate it. He found himself, on more than one occasion late at night, thinking of the wife he had cast aside, wondering, with a discomfort he rarely allowed himself to fully examine, whether he had made a mistake he could never take back. He did not speak these thoughts aloud. He was, after all, the Alpha King, and Alpha Kings were not meant to admit doubt about decisions they themselves had made in front of the entire council. But the doubt lingered, quiet and persistent, growing slightly stronger each year that passed. Each year that the kingdom he ruled with Sable grew more fractious and less content than the one he had once ruled, imperfectly, but genuinely, alongside Illyra. It was in the 5th year after Illyra's departure that news of the border alliance finally reached Chaol directly, delivered by one of his border commanders during a routine council meeting. "There's a coalition forming south of our territory," the commander reported. "Several settlements that were previously scattered and disorganized have banded together under some kind of shared leadership. They've repelled at least 2 incursions from eastern rogues in the past few years, and their influence seems to be growing. Merchants speak of them with increasing frequency." "Who leads them?" Chaol asked, more out of routine diligence than genuine interest, his mind already half occupied with other matters on the council's agenda. The commander consulted his notes. "A woman, my lord, goes by the name Illyra, no surname that anyone's been able to confirm." Chaol went very still. It was not an uncommon name, he told himself in the silence that followed. The silence that stretched perhaps a beat too long before he managed to respond. There were surely other wolves in the world who carried that name. It meant nothing, most likely, beyond coincidence. But some part of him, some part connected still, faintly and distantly, to a bond that had never been fully and properly severed despite everything that had happened, felt a shiver of recognition he could not entirely dismiss. "Continue monitoring the situation," he told the commander, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "I want regular reports on this alliance. Its size, its leadership, its intentions toward our territory." The commander nodded and moved on to the next item on the agenda, unaware of the storm his brief report had stirred in his king. Chaol sat through the remainder of the meeting in a state of distraction he rarely allowed himself, his mind returning again and again to a single word. Illyra. It could not be her, he had told himself, for 5 years, that she was likely dead, lost to the dangers of the free lands, or living some small, anonymous life, far removed from anything that would ever intersect with his again. He had told himself this because it was easier than imagining the alternative, easier than confronting what it might mean if the wife he had discarded had survived, had thrived, had built something powerful enough to draw the attention of his own border commanders. That night, alone in his chambers, Chaol found himself standing at the window that faced south, toward the free lands beyond his borders, feeling something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Curiosity. And beneath it, something sharper, something closer to fear. What if it truly was her? And what had she become, in the years since he had broken the bond between them, and cast her out into a world he had never expected her to survive? The reports continued to arrive over the following months, each one confirming what Cale had feared, and, in some strange corner of himself he did not examine too closely, hoped. It was her. A traitor who had done business directly with the Border Alliance confirmed, under careful questioning from one of Cale's commanders, that the leader called Alira matched the description of the former Draven Queen almost perfectly, down to details the traitor could not have known unless he had actually seen her. Dark hair, a particular way of tilting her head when she listened carefully to someone speaking, a small scar above her left eyebrow, the result of a childhood accident Cale remembered clearly because he had once, in the earliest and happiest days of their bond, kissed that scar and asked her how she'd gotten it. Cale did not share this confirmation with the council. He kept it close, turning it over in his mind during long, sleepless nights, unable to decide what it meant that Alira had not only survived, but had built something that now rivaled, in its own quiet way, the kingdom he ruled. His marriage to Sable, meanwhile, continued its slow deterioration. The cracks that had been forming for years widened further as Sable's rule grew increasingly unpopular among the pack. A harsh winter that fifth year led to food shortages, and Sable's response, favoring the fortress's inner circle over the wider pack in the distribution of what limited supplies remained, sparked open grumbling among families who had once been fiercely loyal to the crown. Cale found himself, more and more often, stepping in to soften decisions Sable had made unilaterally, undoing punishments she had ordered in fits of temper, apologizing on her behalf to pack members she had alienated through her increasingly erratic leadership. "You undermine me every time you do this," Sable snapped at him one evening, after he had quietly reversed her decision to exile a family for a minor grain theft, driven by genuine hunger rather than malice. "How am I supposed to command respect if you keep contradicting me in front of the entire pack?" "You'll command respect," Cale said, his patience worn thin, "when you make decisions that deserve it. Exiling a starving family over a handful of grain isn't leadership, Sable. It's cruelty." "Alira would have let them starve quietly and called it mercy," Sable shot back, her voice sharp with an old, familiar bitterness. "At least I actually do something." The mention of Alira's name, delivered with such casual contempt, struck something in Cale he had not expected. He found himself, in that moment, comparing the two sisters with a clarity he had avoided for years. Alira had never needed to punish anyone to command respect. Her authority had come from something quieter, something people had trusted because they had seen, again and again, that she acted with their genuine interest at heart. Sable ruled through fear because she had never learned, or never cared to learn, how to rule any other way. He did not say any of this aloud, but the thought lodged itself somewhere deep in his chest and would not leave him alone. As the 6th year since Alira's departure began, the situation along the southern border grew more complicated. The Border Alliance, now firmly established as a legitimate power in the Free Lands, had begun to attract attention not only from Draven territory, but from several other established packs, whose borders touched the Free Lands at various points. Some viewed the alliance as a threat, a destabilizing force that upset the traditional balance of power between organized packs and the scattered rogues who had always lived beyond their reach. Others viewed it with cautious respect, recognizing that a well-organized neighbor, even one built on unconventional principles, was often preferable to the chaos of disorganized rogue territory. Cale found himself caught between these perspectives, uncertain how to approach a growing power led by the woman he had once broken a sacred bond to be rid of. His council was divided. Some advisors urged him to treat the alliance as a threat, requiring a show of force before it grew too strong to contain. Others, more cautious, suggested that antagonizing a well-organized coalition of former rogues could prove costly and unnecessary, especially given the alliance had shown no aggression toward Draven territory in the years since its formation. It was Petra Lindquist, the same elder who had cautioned Cale against the severing ritual all those years ago, who finally spoke the words no one else on the council had been willing to say directly. "You know who leads them," she said. During a private meeting Kale had called to discuss the growing situation. It was not a question. Kale was quiet for a long moment. I suspected, he admitted finally. I've had it confirmed. And you've said nothing to the council. Nothing to your queen. What would I say? Kale asked, and there was more raw honesty in the question than he had intended to reveal. That the wife I broke a fated bond to discard has built something more stable and more respected than the kingdom I currently rule? That she survived everything I put her through and came out stronger for it? Petra studied him with the same careful, appraising look she had given him years earlier, in the council chamber, where he had first announced his intention to sever his bond with Alira. You still carry regret for what you did to her. It was not a question either, and Kale did not bother denying it. I made a choice I believed was right at the time. I've had years to understand how wrong I was. Then perhaps, Petra said carefully, the wisest path forward is not conflict with this alliance, but an attempt to understand it. To understand her, whatever history exists between you, the fact remains that she has built something significant along our border, and pretending otherwise, or approaching it with hostility born from your own guilt, will serve no one well. Kale turned her words over in his mind for days afterward, unable to shake the sense that some kind of reckoning was approaching, one he had spent years avoiding and could no longer put off indefinitely. The reckoning, when it came, was forced by circumstances neither Kale nor Alira had chosen. A dispute arose over a stretch of contested territory along the border between Draven lands and the free lands the Border Alliance now protected, a strip of forest rich with game and fresh water that both sides had informally used for generations without serious conflict. That understanding broke down when a group of Draven hunters, unaware of shifting boundaries the Alliance had begun enforcing more strictly as its influence grew, clashed with Alliance patrols over hunting rights in the disputed territory. The confrontation, while it ended without serious violence, left both sides bruised and angry, and word of it spread quickly through both territories, threatening to escalate into something far more serious if not addressed directly. Kale's council, alarmed by the potential for genuine conflict, urged him to resolve the matter personally rather than through intermediaries, given the sensitivity of the situation and the importance of maintaining stability along a border that had, until now, remained relatively peaceful. You'll need to meet with their leadership directly, one of his commanders advised. A dispute of this nature, left to fester, could spiral into something none of us want. Better to address it now, alpha to alpha, before it grows beyond control. Kale knew, even as the commander spoke, exactly what that meeting would mean. 6 years after he had stood in a council chamber and announced his intention to sever his bond with Alira, 6 years after she had vanished into the free lands he had assumed would either kill her or break her, he would have to stand before her again, not as her husband, not as the man who had once held her heart, but as the leader of a rival territory forced to negotiate with a woman he had wronged beyond measure. He thought, in the days leading up to the meeting, of every version of this encounter he might face. He imagined her broken, diminished by years of hardship, perhaps grateful for whatever concessions he offered simply to avoid further conflict with a kingdom stronger than her fledgling alliance. He imagined her furious, unable to set aside years of justified anger long enough to negotiate in good faith. He imagined, though he tried not to dwell on this particular version too long, that she might have moved on so completely that seeing him again would stir nothing in her at all, that whatever remained of their bond, however faded and scarred, meant nothing to the woman she had become. He did not know, could not have known, which version of Alira he would actually find waiting for him at the border. He only knew that after 6 years of distance, of guilt he had never fully processed, of a marriage to her sister that had brought him none of the fulfillment he had once believed it would, he was finally going to face the consequences of the choice he had made in that council chamber so many years before. Sable, when she learned of the planned meeting, reacted with an anger that surprised even Kale, who had grown accustomed to her temper over the years. "You're going to see her," she said, not bothering to disguise the venom in her voice. "After everything, you're going to stand across from her and pretend this is simply a matter of border politics." "It is a matter of border politics," Kale said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not entirely true. "The alliance she leads has grown too significant to ignore, Sable. This isn't about the past, isn't it? Sable's eyes were sharp, calculating in a way that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the ambition that had first drawn her to betray her own sister all those years ago. You've been distracted for months, ever since her name first reached this fortress. Don't insult me by pretending this is purely business. Cale did not answer her, because he did not fully trust himself to answer honestly, and a dishonest answer felt, in that moment, like one betrayal too many to add to a list already too long. He left the fortress 2 days later, accompanied by a small contingent of guards and advisors, traveling south toward a border he had once believed Elira would never survive crossing, let alone command. He did not know what he would say to her when he finally arrived. He only knew that whatever waited for him at that border, he could no longer avoid it. The years of distance, of unspoken guilt, of a marriage built on betrayal that had slowly curdled into something neither partner found fulfilling, had led inevitably to this moment. Cale Draven, Alpha King of the North, was finally going to stand before the woman whose heart he had broken, and whose life he had upended, and he had no idea, as his party rode south through the thickening forest, whether she would meet him with mercy or with the full weight of everything he deserved. News of the planned meeting reached Elira 3 days before Cale's party set out from the fortress, carried by one of the Alliance's own scouts who had observed unusual activity along the Draven border and reported it immediately to the council. "They're sending a delegation," the scout reported, standing before the assembled leadership of the Border Alliance in the meeting hall Thornhollow had built specifically for gatherings of this kind. "Word from our contact within their border patrol suggests the king himself intends to lead it." Elira felt something settle heavily in her chest at the news, a sensation she had not experienced in years, not since the earliest days of her exile when every sound in the forest had made her heart race with fear. She had built a life, over 6 years, in which Cale Draven existed only as a distant memory. A chapter of her history she had closed and moved past. The idea that he might soon stand before her again, in the flesh, forced her to confront feelings she had believed long since resolved. "We knew this day might come, eventually," Dorian said quietly, seated beside her at the long table, where the Alliance's leadership gathered to discuss matters affecting all the settlements under their protection. Over the years, he had become not only her partner in the quiet, unhurried way their relationship had developed, but also one of her closest advisors, someone whose steady judgment she had come to rely on deeply. The territory dispute was always going to require this kind of resolution eventually. "I know," Elira said. "I simply didn't expect it to be him personally." "Do you want someone else to handle the negotiations?" Odessa asked gently, watching her with the same careful attentiveness she had shown since the night Elira first arrived in Thornhollow, half-starved and running from a life that had nearly destroyed her. "No one here would think less of you for stepping back from this particular meeting." Elira sat with the question for a long moment, feeling the pull of old fear, the temptation to hide from a confrontation that promised to be painful, regardless of how it unfolded. But she thought, too, of the woman she had become in the 6 years since she crossed that border. She thought of everything she had built, everything she had earned through her own effort rather than inherited through a bond or a marriage. She thought of the fear that had once controlled her, the fear that had made her flee in the dead of night rather than face the possibility of standing her ground. She was not that frightened young woman anymore. She had not spent 6 years rebuilding herself, only to shrink away from the man who had broken her, now that he finally stood at the edge of the world she had built. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'll meet with him myself. This is my alliance, built by my hands and the hands of everyone at this table. I won't hide from a border dispute, simply because the man leading the other side happens to be someone from my past." The council nodded, respecting her decision without further argument, and the following days were spent in careful preparation, reviewing the details of the territorial dispute, considering what concessions might be reasonable, and what lines the alliance would not cross regardless of pressure from a kingdom stronger, in raw numbers, than their own coalition of settlements. The night before Cale's party was expected to arrive, Elira found herself unable to sleep, standing outside her small home at the edge of Thornhollow, looking north toward the mountains where the Draven fortress stood, just as she had done countless times in her earliest years of exile. The scar of their bond, faint and quiet after so many years apart, stirred faintly in her chest, a sensation she had grown accustomed to over time, but that felt sharper now, knowing he was drawing closer with each passing hour. Dorian found her there sometime past midnight, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill without a word, simply standing beside her in the quiet darkness. "Are you afraid?" he asked eventually. Elira considered the question honestly before answering. "Not of him," she said. "Not anymore. I think I'm afraid of who I might have been, if things had gone differently, if I had stayed, if I had let that ritual break me the way he expected it to." "You didn't stay," Dorian said simply. "You didn't let it break you. Whoever you might have been in some other version of your life doesn't matter now. This is who you are. This is what you built." Elira leaned into him slightly, grateful for his presence, for the steadiness he had brought into her life over the years, without ever demanding that she be anyone other than exactly who she was. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for 6 years of standing beside me while I figured out who I was without a crown telling me." "You never needed a crown," Dorian said. "You needed time, and the chance to prove it to yourself. You've done both." They stood together in the darkness for a long while, and when Elira finally returned to her home to attempt a few hours of sleep before the morning's preparations began, she felt something she had not expected to feel on the eve of facing Chaol Draven again. She felt ready. Chaol's party arrived at the agreed meeting point, a clearing near the disputed territory that both sides had chosen as neutral ground, shortly after midday. Elira arrived with her own small contingent, deliberately modest in size, a deliberate choice meant to demonstrate that the alliance did not need an overwhelming show of force to negotiate as equals. She saw him before he saw her, sitting astride a dark horse at the head of his delegation, older than the man she remembered, lines of stress and time visible on a face that had once looked at her with what she had believed, in her youth and naivety, was genuine devotion. She watched him scan the clearing, his eyes moving over her small delegation, and she saw the exact moment he found her, the way his entire posture changed, the way something in his expression cracked open, despite what must have been years of careful practice at maintaining a king's composure. "Elira," he said, and his voice carried across the clearing, rough with an emotion he seemed unable to fully suppress. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She met his gaze steadily, the same way she had learned to meet every challenge in the 6 years since he had cast her out, and she said, in a voice that carried its own quiet authority, "Chaol, I understand we have territory to discuss." The formality of her tone seemed to catch him off guard, as though he had expected something else entirely from this reunion, some display of lingering pain or unresolved longing that would give him an opening to address the history between them before turning to matters of policy. Instead, he found himself facing a leader entirely in command of herself, someone who had clearly decided that whatever remained unresolved between them would not be settled in front of 2 delegations gathered to discuss a border dispute. "Yes," he said, recovering himself with visible effort. "Territory, of course." The negotiations that followed were conducted with a professionalism that surprised several members of both delegations, who had expected, given the history between the 2 leaders, a far more contentious or emotional exchange. Elira presented the alliance's position clearly and firmly, backed by careful documentation of the traditional use patterns both sides had followed for generations before the recent conflict. Chaol, for his part, listened more than he spoke, deferring often to his advisors on matters of detail, while watching Elira with an intensity that several observers noted, but no one commented on directly. By the time the sun began to set, the 2 delegations had reached a workable compromise, a revised boundary that acknowledged the alliance's legitimate claim to portions of the disputed territory while preserving traditional hunting rights for Draven pack members in areas where conflict was less likely to arise. It was, by any reasonable measure, a successful negotiation, the kind of resolution that prevented the border dispute from escalating into something far more costly for both sides. As the formal proceedings concluded, and both delegations began preparations to return to their respective territories for the evening, Chaol approached Elira directly, separate from the rest of his party, his expression carrying a weight that had nothing to do with matters of territory or policy. "Might I speak with you?" he asked quietly, privately, "before we part ways?" Elira studied him for a long moment, weighing the request against everything she had built in the years since she last stood this close to him. Part of her wanted to refuse, to protect the careful distance she had maintained throughout the day's negotiations, the professional composure that had allowed her to face him without reopening wounds she had spent years healing. But another part of her, older and more honest, recognized that some version of this conversation had always been inevitable, that she could not truly close the chapter of her life that Cale Draven represented without finally saying, directly to his face, everything the years of distance had never allowed her to say. "Fine," she said finally. "A few minutes. Nothing more." She gestured toward the edge of the clearing, away from both delegations, and Cale followed her, and for the first time in 6 years, the two of them stood facing each other with no council chamber, no delegations, no border dispute standing between them, only the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that remained unspoken. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The last light of the setting sun filtered through the trees at the edge of the clearing, casting long shadows across the ground between them, and Elira found herself studying Cale's face with a strange, clinical distance, as though examining a stranger, rather than the man who had once held her heart so completely. He looked older than his years, the confidence that had once defined him, the easy assurance of a king who had never truly doubted his own decisions, had given way to something more uncertain, more worn. She wondered, distantly, what 6 years on the throne beside her sister had cost him, beyond whatever guilt he clearly still carried over what he had done to her. "I owe you an apology," Cale said finally, his voice quieter than she had heard it in years. "Not the kind I offered in that council chamber, dressed up as policy and necessity, a real one." "You had 6 years to offer that apology," Elira said evenly. "You chose not to send it." "I didn't know if you'd survived," he admitted. "For the first year, I told myself you had likely died somewhere in the Freelands, that whatever guilt I carried was pointless to dwell on, because there was no one left to address it to. It was easier to believe that than to imagine you out there, alone, suffering because of what I did." "I did suffer," Elira said, her voice steady despite the weight of the admission. "For a long time, the hunger, the cold, the fear of every stranger I encountered in those first weeks. I nearly died more than once in those early days, Cale, not from the severing, since I was never in the fortress when whatever ritual you performed actually took place. From simple exposure, from not knowing how to survive outside the walls you raised me within." Cale flinched visibly at her words, guilt clear on his face. "I'm sorry. I know that means very little, after everything, but I am sorry, Elira, for all of it. For the affair, for the way I ended our bond, for the manner in which I did it, in front of the entire council, rather than having the courage to face you honestly and privately. I was a coward, and you paid the price for my cowardice." Elira was quiet for a moment, letting his words settle, testing them against the anger she had carried for so long, the anger that had fueled her through those first desperate months of survival. She found, to her own surprise, that the anger, while still present, no longer burned with the same consuming intensity it once had. Time, and the life she had built despite everything he had taken from her, had tempered it into something more manageable, something she could examine without being consumed by it. "I'm not the same woman you broke that bond with," she said finally. "I want you to understand that clearly, before whatever comes next between our territories. I'm not seeking your apology, Cale. I stopped needing anything from you a long time ago. I built a life, a real one, with people who value me for who I am, rather than the position I happen to hold beside a throne." "I can see that," Cale said quietly, and there was something in his voice, an admiration he did not try to hide, that surprised her. "Everyone speaks of what you've built here, the alliance, the way you lead. It's remarkable, Elira. You did all of this without a crown, without a bond, without any of the things I once believed you needed in order to matter." "I never needed those things," Elira said. "I only believed I did, because that was the story I was raised to believe. That a woman's worth came from her bond, from her marriage, from her proximity to power, rather than anything she built herself. You and Sable taught me, in the cruelest way possible, that those beliefs were false. I'm almost grateful for that lesson now, difficult as it was to learn." Cale absorbed her words in silence, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she had not expected. My marriage to Sable has not been what either of us hoped it would be. I won't pretend otherwise, not to you, of all people. It was built on betrayal, and I've come to understand, slowly and painfully, that nothing built that way can truly last, no matter how much ambition or convenience holds it together in the beginning. I'm not interested in the details of your marriage, Elira said, and though her voice remained even, there was a firmness in it that left no room for misunderstanding. That's not why I agreed to speak with you privately, Kale. Whatever difficulties exist between you and my sister are not mine to solve, and I won't be drawn into them, not after everything. I understand, Kale said quickly. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I only wanted you to know the truth, since you deserve honesty from me now, even 6 years too late. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the last light fading from the clearing around them, and Elira found herself considering, with a clarity that surprised her, exactly what she wanted to say before this conversation, and this chapter of her life, finally closed for good. I forgive you, she said finally, and watched surprise flicker across his face. Not because you deserve it, and not because I've forgotten what you did. I forgive you, because carrying that anger any longer serves no purpose in the life I've built. You made your choice 6 years ago, and I made mine, when I walked across that border rather than staying to be broken by a ritual I never consented to. We both have to live with the consequences of those choices. I've made my peace with mine. It's time you found a way to make peace with yours, without expecting me to carry any part of that burden for you. Thank you, Kale said quietly, and there was genuine emotion in his voice, gratitude mixed with something that looked almost like grief, for a life he had thrown away without ever fully understanding its value until it was gone. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless. You don't need to deserve it, Elira said. That's the nature of forgiveness. It's given, not earned, at least when it's genuine. But Kale, I need you to understand something clearly, before we return to our respective territories tonight. This forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean I have any desire to reopen what existed between us, whatever faded remnant of our bond might still linger. I've built a life here, a good one, with people who love me for exactly who I am. I won't trade that for anything, least of all for a chance to relive a past that nearly destroyed me. Kale nodded slowly, accepting her words with a solemnity that suggested he had, on some level, expected this outcome even as some smaller, more hopeful part of him had wished for something different. I understand, he said. I won't pretend I didn't hope, in some corner of my heart, for a different kind of conversation tonight. But I respect what you've built, and I respect what you deserve, which is far more than what I offered you before. Thank you for that at least, Elira said, and something in her chest, some final knot of tension she had carried since first hearing news of his planned visit, finally loosened. The two of them stood together for a few moments longer in the gathering darkness, not as king and rejected mate, not as husband and wife torn apart by betrayal, but simply as two people who had once shared a life, and had each, in their own separate ways, survived the ending of it. I should return to my delegation, Kale said finally. Thank you, Elira, for the negotiation, and for this conversation. Both were more than I had any right to expect from you. Safe travels, Kale, Elira said, and meant it, in the quiet, unburdened way one might wish safety to any traveler embarking on a long journey home. She watched him walk back toward his delegation, watched him mount his horse and gather his advisors for the journey north, back toward the fortress and the marriage, and the kingdom he had built in her absence. And as his party disappeared into the darkening forest, Elira felt something settle within her, a sense of completion she had not fully expected to feel, even after 6 years of believing she had already made peace with everything that happened that night in the West Corridor. She turned and walked back toward her own delegation, toward Dorian and Odessa and the small group of allies who had traveled with her to this meeting, and she found Dorian watching her with quiet, careful attention, searching her face for signs of how the private conversation had left her. Are you all right? He asked, as they began the journey back toward Thornhollow together. Elira considered the question seriously before answering, taking stock of herself in a way she had not had the chance to do since Kale's delegation first arrived in the clearing that morning. "I think," she said finally, "I'm better than all right." I think that conversation was the last thing I needed to finally close that door completely. Dorian reached for her hand, and she let him take it, grateful for the warmth of his presence after a day that had asked so much of her. "Then let's go home," he said simply. Elira nodded, and together they rode back toward Thornhollow, toward the life she had built with her own hands out of the wreckage Kale and Sable had left behind, toward a future that belonged entirely to her, unburdened at last by the ghosts of a past she had finally, fully, laid to rest. News of the border negotiation reached the Draven fortress before Kale's delegation did, carried swiftly by scouts eager to report the peaceful resolution of a dispute that had threatened to escalate into something far more costly. Sable heard the reports in the Great Hall, surrounded by advisors relieved at the news of averted conflict, and felt none of the relief that colored the faces around her. She had spent 6 years telling herself a careful story about her sister's disappearance, a story in which Elira had been too weak, too unsuited to the demands of real power, to survive outside the protective walls of the fortress. It was a story that had allowed Sable to sleep at night, to sit on a throne she had taken through betrayal, without confronting too directly the cost of what she had done. The news arriving from the border, of an alliance built and led successfully by the very sister she had dismissed as too soft for such things, threatened to unravel that careful story entirely. When Kale returned 2 days later, Sable was waiting for him in their private chambers, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes sharp with questions she had been rehearsing since the first reports arrived. "I hear the negotiations went well," she said, her tone deceptively light. "I also hear you spoke with her privately, after the formal proceedings concluded." Kale did not bother denying it. He had grown tired in recent years of the careful deceptions that had once characterized his relationship with Sable, tired of managing her temper through half-truths and strategic omissions. "I did," he said simply. "I owed her an apology, one I should have offered years ago." "And did she accept it?" Sable's voice carried an edge that suggested she already suspected the answer and resented it deeply. "She forgave me," Kale said. "Which is more than I deserved, and considerably more grace than I've received from you in 6 years of marriage." Something flashed across Sable's face, an old, familiar anger that had grown more frequent and more difficult to soothe with each passing year of their increasingly troubled marriage. "You still love her?" It was not a question Kale could answer honestly, without causing further damage to a marriage that had already sustained more damage than either of them cared to fully acknowledge. He chose instead to answer with the truth he had been avoiding for longer than he cared to admit, even to himself. "I don't know what I feel for her anymore," he said carefully. "I know I respect what she's built, more than I've respected almost anything in my own life these past 6 years. I know that seeing her again reminded me of a version of myself I lost somewhere along the way, a version that valued honesty and partnership over ambition and convenience." "So you're saying our marriage was a mistake," Sable said, her voice flat. Kale was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I'm saying our marriage was built on a betrayal, Sable. Yours against your own sister, and mine against a bond I should have honored regardless of whatever doubts I carried. I don't know how a marriage built that way was ever supposed to become something healthy and lasting. I think, if we're both honest with ourselves, we've known for years that it hasn't." The conversation that followed was long and difficult, stretching late into the night, touching on years of accumulated grievances neither of them had fully voiced before. By its end, both Kale and Sable had arrived, separately and reluctantly, at a conclusion neither had wanted to face directly, until forced to by the events of the previous days. Their marriage, built on the wreckage of Elira's betrayal, could not continue as it had been. The dissolution of Kale and Sable's marriage, when it finally came several months later, was handled with far more care and far less public spectacle than the severing of Kale's original bond with Elira had been. There was no council chamber announcement designed to make cruelty look like policy, no scheduled ritual meant to inflict maximum pain on the party being cast aside. Instead, there was a quiet, difficult negotiation between two people who had built something together that had never truly worked, culminating in Sable's departure from the fortress to territory belonging to distant relations on their mother's side, territory where she could begin, however imperfectly, to build a life separate from the throne she had once been so desperate to claim. Sable did not seek out Alira before her departure. Whatever reckoning existed between the twin sisters remained unaddressed, a door neither of them chose to open, even as the larger conflict between Chaol and Alira found its own uneasy resolution. Alira, when word of the dissolution eventually reached her through the same trade networks that carried most news between the territories, felt something complicated stir in her chest, not quite satisfaction, not quite sympathy, but something adjacent to both. She did not reach out to her sister. Some wounds, she had come to understand over the years, were not meant to be reopened simply because circumstances had shifted. Sable had made her choices, just as Alira had made hers, and whatever consequences followed from those choices belonged to each of them separately now. Chaol's fortress, in the years that followed, settled into a kind of stability it had not known since before Alira's original departure. He ruled alone for a time, more thoughtful and less certain of his own righteousness than he had been in his younger years, guided by lessons learned through loss and consequence, rather than the easy confidence of a king who had never truly been tested. The relationship between Draven territory and the Border Alliance evolved, over the following years, into something unexpected, a genuine, if cautious, partnership between two neighboring powers who had found, through the difficult negotiation that first brought them together, that cooperation served both sides better than the suspicion and conflict that had once seemed inevitable. Trade flowed more freely between the territories. Disputes, when they arose, were settled through the kind of measured negotiation that had characterized that first difficult meeting, rather than through force or intimidation. Alira and Chaol crossed paths occasionally in the years that followed, at gatherings between the territories, at negotiations over matters affecting both sides of the border. Each time, Alira found the encounters easier than the last, the old wounds having settled fully into scars that no longer ached with every reminder of what had once been. She watched Chaol grow into a wiser, more careful leader than the young king who had once broken her heart so carelessly, and she found she could acknowledge that growth, without feeling any pull to return to what they had once shared. Her life, in those years, belonged entirely to the world she had built with her own hands. The Border Alliance continued to grow and strengthen, its settlements more secure, more prosperous, more genuinely content than they had been in the isolated, vulnerable years before Alira's arrival. She remained at the center of that alliance, respected not because of any bond or crown, but because she had spent years proving, through action rather than inheritance, that she deserved the trust placed in her. Her relationship with Dorian deepened over time, into something neither of them rushed to formalize, but both understood, quietly and completely, to be permanent. They did not bond in the way alphas and their fated mates were said to bond, with the sudden, undeniable certainty that had once connected Alira to Chaol. Instead, their connection grew slowly, deliberately, built day by day through years of shared work and mutual respect. A foundation Alira had come to understand was far sturdier than the fate that had once seemed to promise her everything, and had, in the end, delivered only heartbreak. On the evening of the 7th anniversary of her arrival in Thornhollow, Alira stood once again at the edge of the village, looking north toward the mountains where the Draven fortress stood, just as she had done countless times over the years since her escape. The pull she had once felt toward that fortress, the faint, scarred remnant of a bond broken long ago, had faded almost entirely now, replaced by something steadier, something that belonged entirely to the present, rather than to a past she had long since made peace with. Dorian found her there, as he often did on quiet evenings, and stood beside her without a word, simply sharing the stillness of the moment. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked eventually, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Everything that happened, the bond, the betrayal, all of it. If none of it had happened, you'd likely still be a queen in that fortress, living a very different life than the one you've built here." Alira considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, weighing it against everything she had learned in the years since that terrible night in the West Corridor. "No," she said finally, and meant it completely. "I don't regret it. I regret the pain, certainly. I regret the betrayal, and the cruelty of how it was handled, and the years it took me to fully heal from what they did to me. But I don't regret who I became because of it. I don't regret this life, this alliance, the people who trust me because I earned that trust rather than inherited it. You built something remarkable, Dorian said quietly, out of the worst thing that ever happened to you. I did, Elira agreed, and there was quiet pride in her voice, the hard-earned pride of a woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing, who had turned exile and heartbreak into strength and purpose. And I did it without a crown, without a bond, without anyone's permission. I did it because I chose to, every single day, even when it would have been easier to give up. She turned away from the mountains then, away from the fortress and the past it represented, and looked instead toward the village she had helped build, toward the lights beginning to flicker on in windows across Thornhollow as evening settled over the free lands. This was her home now, earned rather than given, built rather than inherited. This was the life that truly belonged to her. Come on, she said, taking Dorian's hand. Odessa's expecting us for dinner, and I'd rather not keep her waiting. They walked together back into the village, leaving the mountains and the memory of the fortress behind them, and Elira felt, as she often did in these quiet evening moments, a deep and settled gratitude for the woman she had become. She had crossed a border 7 years earlier, as a broken, betrayed young queen, with nothing but a small pack and a borrowed blade. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, into someone stronger, wiser, and more genuinely respected than she had ever been within the walls of the fortress she once called home. The Alpha King had broken their bond and chosen her own twin sister over her. He had cast her out, expecting her to be destroyed by it. Instead, she had built a kingdom of her own, one earned through strength and integrity rather than granted by fate, and in the end, it was Kael who had come to stand at her border, not as a conqueror, but as a man forced to reckon with everything he had lost the moment he chose betrayal over honesty. Elira Voss had survived. More than survived, she had thrived, and the life she now lived, surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was, stood as the truest and most complete answer to every cruelty that had once been inflicted upon her. She did not need a crown to know her own worth. She had built something far more lasting than any throne, and no bond, broken or otherwise, could ever take that away from her again.